Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Todd, President and CEO at Prevent Blindness. Welcome to this episode of our Focus on Eye Health series. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Brad and Bryan Manning, also known as the Two Blind Brothers. Brad and Bryan have taken their personal experience with vision loss and turned it into a mission-driven fashion brand. It's raising awareness for retinal eye disease as well as funding for research. Since May is Inherited Retinal Disease Awareness Month here at Prevent Blindness, we're talking with the brothers specifically about Stargardt disease, the condition both live with. We'll hear about their experiences, what they've learned along the way, and how they're using their platform to advocate, educate, and inspire. Hi, Brad and Bryan. Thanks for joining us today. As we get going around Stargardt's disease, Brad, could you explain a little bit about what Stargardt disease is and how it affects your vision?
Yeah, so Stargardt's disease is a juvenile form of macular degeneration. So a lot of people whose parents, grandparents, if you're older, you have a chance of getting AMD. And we have this juvenile form of it. So what happens is when you have Stargardt's, you lose your center vision over time. Often people with Stargardt's disease will keep a lot of peripheral vision. And the reason that the disease happens is it's a problem metabolizing vitamin A. So people with Stargardt's, they don't metabolize vitamin A correctly. It leaves behind this little byproduct called lipofuscin that kills the cells in the center vision, and that's what causes the degeneration. But, we've been lucky to do well enough with it, and as Bryan likes to call it, the Ferrari of retinal eye disease.
It's awesome.
When were you each diagnosed, and what was that experience like for each of you?
Well, I guess I'll go first since I'm the older brother. I was diagnosed first, but basically, I failed the kindergarten eye chart. It started this 2-year hunt to figure out what had happened to my eyesight. And after a lot of doctors and a lot of bad guesses, I end up in this one office with my mom. They do what was called a phalangioangiogram, this test where they dye your blood. Now they can do a gene test, and they could see the scar tissue in my eye. And, I was so young at the time. When we got back in the car, my mom was sort of speechless because the doctor said, "Hey, this is a condition with no cure. Take your son home, teach him Braille, get him a magnifier, and best of luck." And so as my mom is sort of sitting there processing it, she says, "F this." And she says, "Let's go to Friendly's and get some ice cream." And actually, as an aside, that's what I thought "F this" meant for a while. And then we went to Blockbuster, got the movie Air Bud, and was watching this golden retriever play for the high school basketball team. It actually was probably one of the best days of my entire life.
That's a great story. What about you, Bryan?
Yeah, well, to dovetail it, I had a very similar effing experience with a very similar effing doctor. The only major deviation is I got Airbud 2 Golden Receiver. A couple years later, dual threat dog, and he's now playing football. It was truly miraculous. But at that time, as Brad said, we were too young to really understand the gravity of the diagnosis or any of the challenges, and our mom and dad did a great job of shielding us from that initial moment. And I thought one interesting thing is, we've actually been able to talk to our parents about this a lot, running this project, and you get different perspective. And they said they had a crazy realization that when they walked out of the room, they were so upset, they were devastated. And then they walked back in the room half an hour later, and we were the same kid. Nothing had changed from Monday to Tuesday except for getting the diagnosis. And so they just kind of made it a point that this was just something we were going to have to live with. And at some level, we were fortunate that we knew what one of our biggest challenges were in our life. We knew that having bad vision was going to be a hurdle we'd always have to clear. And everybody has those problems, and being able to understand that from a young age actually gave us the freedom to go out and try and fail and succeed in equal measure based on our ability, but more importantly, based on our willingness to put in the effort.
And I imagine one thing that was probably different is, did your parents probably knew that there was a chance that you had the condition as well, right, Bryan?
Yeah, as an inherited disease, it was. We have a middle sister who didn't have any eye trouble, and then once I started showing symptoms at 5 or 6 years old, they were pretty quick to diagnose.
Well, as someone who has a twin brother, one of the things I'm always frustrated by is everyone just assuming that everything happens to us the same. So I'm curious, how is each of your vision, and is it different from one another? And I guess, the typical Stargardt's patient experiences vision differently, right? And I'm curious how that relates to your experience.
I think Brian and I have fairly similar vision. Sometimes we'll be like surprised, maybe more so me than this happens more to me that he can see something that I might not be able to see. But I think whatever we got genetically tested. I think we have similar, the same mutations. So I think that probably means we're having similar vision. I will say this, we hadn't met that many folks with Stargardt's prior to, maybe none, that prior to starting Two Blind Brothers. And that has been one of the interesting things is we've now met hundreds, and it's true, not everybody has condition presents the same. We've met folks with Stargardt who see better than us. Who have been diagnosed much later in life than us. We've met folks with Stargardt who have like a guide dog or a cane, which we don't use. And I mean, so there definitely is some variance in the disease.
Well, Brian, you touched on this a little bit, but it sounds like your parents just managed this really terrifically. And I know I've spoken with a lot of parents with inherited retinal diseases, and that initial reaction is always challenging. But what would you say to parents who just found out that their child's been diagnosed with an IRD? Are there things that you would encourage them to ask their doctors, or what would you say to them?
I think one of the big pieces of advice that Brad and I really uh, adhere to pretty strongly is you have to understand where to meet the person that's been diagnosed with the IRD in that moment, right? So at 7 years old, just diagnosed, being told, "Hey, this disease is actually going to be a blessing for you. You're going to be able to grow up, and you're going to be able to run this great business. You'll be able to run marathons, and you'll be able to do all these amazing things. And this disease, you won't even think about it most days of the week. Like you're going to be totally awesome and grateful for having this condition." Not what you want to hear at day one diagnosis. And so, in that moment, the world is going to be shaking a lot. I can only imagine the stress, the turmoil, the heartache, the confusion, the anxiety that would propel. But understand that today is today and tomorrow is tomorrow, and that with the way technology is moving, the way medicine is moving, that there's so much opportunity and room for kind of unbelievable growth, that it isn't a death sentence. It isn't something that really will hinder your life. I actually think with where technology is now versus 10, 15 years ago, even though I had better vision then, I see way more now. I'm so much more capable today than I was 10 years ago. Just even though I have worse vision by a bit, it's not even close how much more I can get done today. And so as that progression keeps going, the opportunity to have the eye condition not be a major part of my life is it only gets easier.
Well, I did want to touch on the two blind brothers briefly. You really created something really special with this. Could you talk a little bit about the origin of the two blind brothers and maybe share briefly what it is exactly?
Brian and I were walking around New York City about 8 or 9 years ago now, and we were talking about um, actually a clinical trial patient named Yannick Douay, who was one of the first clinical trial patients for this therapy Luxturna, which is a gene therapy for Leber's congenital amaurosis 5, LCA5. And he had gone from like reading Braille to reading print. and what a medical revolution we were living through. And we were very close with the Foundation Fighting Blindness, which funds all the preclinical research for retinal eye disease. And so we're shopping in a store, and when Bryan and I go anywhere, we lose each other everywhere we go. Although he does have a very visually impaired friendly head, he is sometimes easy to spot in the crowd. We were walking around the store, we lost each other, and we came out about a half an hour later, coincidentally, with this exact same shirt. Because, if you can't see the prices, the labels, the sizes that well, you will grab it, figure out if you love the way it feels, and then maybe we do all the other work to buy it. And we thought maybe there's something to this. What if we started a brand focused on that vigilance to touch, but gave 100% of the profits back to preclinical research, make that contribution to research feel tangible, because research is not linear. It's fail, 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 and then miracle. And so that's when we came up with the idea for Two Blind Brothers.
So, Bryan, could you maybe share a little bit about, have you had any real meaningful moments or responses to developing the Two Blind Brothers?
It's really interesting because what's meaningful changes a lot when you're running a project like this. Early on, when we get the phone call to go on the Ellen DeGeneres show, and we go live in front of 6 million people sitting on the couch, the big check, you think that is going to be the greatest possible moment you could imagine. I mean, it is bananas that you get to even exist in a reality where that's true.
Even bigger than joining the Prevent Blindness Focus on Eye Health Summit?
You didn't let me finish. That's the problem. I'm working up to that. I mean, that is, talk about the peak of Everest. But meaningfulness changes because then you start getting the attention, and when people start Googling blindness or inherited retinal diseases, because the media, we pop up, and we started getting these customer service tickets from families who have been diagnosed or recently diagnosed, or kids. And there's a bunch that really jump out, but there was one early on that kind of really fundamentally changed how we viewed the project. And it was from this college kid named Joe. And in his message, he says, "Hey, I'm Joe. I'm going to UVA. I was diagnosed 2 years ago with RP, and I've been sleeping a lot." And the next sentence really broke our hearts, because he said he's been sleeping a lot because he'd rather be asleep dreaming in 2020 than being awake going blind, which is just as painful of a message as you can read. But, then he went on to say that he actually had been watching some of our content, and that he had actually connected with a couple people in the community, and he had reached out to one of the local chapters of an organization, and he was starting to be optimistic about his blindness for the first time in the 2 years since the diagnosis. And as great as a media hit is, and as great as selling a shirt is, giving that kid 1% more optimism on the outlook on his vision, or helping him helping him slow the spinning down from a world he can't really fully grasp, that's the magic. I mean, that's when something goes from being kind of really fun and really enjoyable to really meaningful and impactful.
That's terrific. Here at Prevent Blindness, we have a project where we work with a number of people living with eye conditions of all sorts. And one of the things that we hear from them is, once they kind of turn their condition into an advocacy moment, or some way to use that publicly to help other people, it really changes the whole experience. Could you talk a little bit about what you might say to a young person who's just been diagnosed with this condition?
Well, I think this is not a rule by any means, but if you're talking about young kids, usually it's tougher on the parents initially, But essentially, what we try to express to people who are newly diagnosed is, now is a time for a deep breath. It's a time to get educated, to gather your resources, to learn. Before, there's something called the psychology of adjustment. oftentimes when something bad happens to somebody or some bad news, there's a tendency to ascribe that moment and project through the rest of your life. This happens sometimes when somebody goes through a breakup or they lose somebody. They never think that they'll feel past that. And, this is true for a tough diagnosis. And so the important part is, be surrounded by good people you love, get educated, get resources, because the next phase is boundary testing, which is a long phase, meaning, you never want the vision impairment to become a psychological impairment. Because your vision is changing, you're not going to know what you're capable of doing. Oftentimes you'll surprise yourself with what you're able to do. And so, and to not lose that spirit of falling down, getting back up. I mean, that is the most important spirit to maintain, because once you self-eliminate yourself from being willing to be a little uncomfortable, be in awkward situations, test new things, then you've really given yourself a disability.
What do you wish people understood about low vision and blindness that you wish more people understood, I guess?
That blind people are the most beautiful people in the entire world. Just unbelievable stunners, left, right, and center. Look at this call right here. I mean, this is
There
catwalk in
you
Milan
go.
Fashion Week. It's a great question, and I think one thing that I always kind of advocate for a little bit is that blindness is really a spectrum, that there really is, from no light sensitivity to 2200 and everything in between exists in that and what somebody who's visually impaired in one field or blind in one field is capable of versus somebody else actually can be wildly different. I mean, if you look at even Stargardt's versus RP, people with RP can read and look at signs and read text and do things that I just are totally out of the scope for me. But mobility is less of an issue for me, which is something that they struggle with. And so, blindness is a really large spectrum that really can encompass a lot. And I maybe I'm more open than most, but if I never am offended or upset when somebody asks a heartfelt question. If somebody is like, "Hey, I notice you're looking really closely at that. Do you have a vision impairment? What's that like?" As long as it feels like it comes from a place of a desire to get educated, I think that's a perfectly wonderful thing, because that creates a alternative advocate or somebody that's a little better informed today than they were yesterday, and maybe down the stream can help somebody else along the way. So I think being on a spectrum and having and kind of willingness to be educated are two things that I always kind of hope for.
That's great. And, I often tell people at the end of the day, you talk about a spectrum. We all have healthcare conditions. Some of them are more serious than others. So we're all on this spectrum of life that has various healthcare conditions. And I just wish we could look more at the individuals than the conditions that they're living with. And some that's more challenging than others. But that's some great advice. Well, before we wrap up here, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience about Stargardt's, IRDs, or general eye health awareness?
I'd like to let people know, if they don't know already, that we are living through a medical revolution. If you aren't paying a lot of attention to this space, you're going to be unbelievably blown away by the clinical trials, the discoveries in basic science. I mean, we are on the cusp of actually curing some of these diseases. I mean, there are actually treatments for some of these conditions, like the LCA5 one that I mentioned, and there's a lot coming. And so the benefit is we all now get to live through the most interesting medical period of advancement probably that's ever occurred. And that's going to be very, very exciting. There's 6 clinical trials right now for Stargardt's disease. I mean, it's come a long way from where we were first diagnosed.
The only thing I'll add is go get your eyes checked. If you're listening to this and you haven't gone in the last year, go get your eyes checked. I was guilty of this for like 4 years. I never went. And one day I was like, God, I am an idiot. So just go get your eyes checked. You'd rather know the news than not know the news, and more than likely they're just going to say it looks good. But having the record is great. Getting into an office is great. So make sure to go get your eyes checked and don't let stuff linger, because if you catch it early, in a lot of cases, there are some really good preventative or slow down measures that you can take.
That's terrific advice. And unfortunately, we know not everyone has the best access to eye care, but anyone out there who needs help, come visit preventblindness.org and we can help you find that access that you need. Well, thanks again, Bryan and Brad. I really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you. Always a pleasure. Always love connecting with you all.
Pleasure was all ours. And I can't wait for the greatest moment still to come.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Thanks again, Brad and Bryan, for taking the time to chat with us today. I encourage everyone to visit the Two Blind Brothers, purchase some fun merchandise while also contributing to eye research. And please visit preventblindness.org to learn more about Stargardt disease, inherited retinal disease, or how to support eye health. And as always, thanks for joining us for the Focus on Eye Health series. See you next time.